Before we begin, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these forgotten cases every week, bringing you the documented truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. On the afternoon of June 22, 1953, a 14-year-old newspaper delivery boy named James Bozart was collecting payment from customers in a 6-story apartment building at 3403 Foster Avenue in the Flatbush neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. The weather that day was warm and humid, typical for late June in the city, with temperatures in the low 80s. James, who lived with his parents and 2 younger siblings in a nearby house on Avenue M, had been delivering newspapers in the neighborhood for approximately 8 months, earning money to help his family and save for a bicycle he wanted to purchase by the end of summer. James's routine that afternoon was the same as it had been dozens of times before. He climbed the building's interior staircase, knocking on doors, collecting coins and occasional dollar bills from subscribers who owed payment for the previous week's deliveries. At approximately 3:45 p.m., he knocked on the door of apartment 4D. A middle-aged woman answered, a 47-year-old secretary who had lived in the building for 3 years. She handed James the exact amount she owed, 55 cents, consisting of 2 quarters and a nickel. James placed the coins in his pocket along with the other money he had collected that afternoon and continued his rounds. He finished collecting payments around 5:20 p.m. and walked home, a distance of approximately 7 blocks. At home, in the small bedroom he shared with his younger brother, James emptied his pockets onto his desk to count the day's earnings. The total came to $4.87. As he sorted the coins, quarters in one pile, dimes in another, nickels in a third, one of the nickels slipped from his fingers and fell approximately 3 feet to the wooden floor. The nickel did not bounce or roll as coins typically do when dropped. Instead, according to James's later testimony to FBI agents, it made a dull sound upon hitting the floor and appeared to split apart. James bent down to examine what had happened and found that the nickel had separated into 2 pieces, a thin shell that formed the outer surface of the coin and a solid inner core. Between these 2 pieces, wedged into a tiny hollow space inside the coin, was a piece of paper so small that James initially thought it might be a manufacturing defect or some kind of packing material. James picked up the paper, which measured approximately 1 centimeter square when unfolded. On it were rows of numbers grouped in sets of 5 digits. The paper was onion skin thin, nearly translucent, with typing so small that the individual numbers were difficult to read without bringing the paper very close to his eyes. James did not understand what he was looking at. The numbers appeared random. No pattern he could discern, nothing that resembled a telephone number or address or any other familiar numerical sequence. James showed the hollow nickel and the paper with numbers to his parents that evening. His father, Robert Bozart, 44 years old, worked as a supervisor at a shipping company in downtown Brooklyn. His mother, Helen, was a homemaker. According to later interviews, both parents examined the coin and the paper with curiosity but without alarm. Robert Bozart suggested that the hollow coin might be some kind of novelty item or possibly a magician's trick coin. The numbers, he thought, might be part of a puzzle or game. He advised James to keep the items. They were unusual, possibly worth keeping as a curiosity. James placed the hollow nickel and the paper in a small wooden box where he kept other items he considered interesting: foreign coins, unusual stamps, a piece of petrified wood he had found on a family trip to Pennsylvania. The nickel remained in that box for approximately 4 months. In late October 1953, James's civics teacher at his junior high school gave an assignment to the class. Each student was to bring to school an example of something related to government, law enforcement, or citizenship, and give a brief presentation explaining its significance. According to later accounts, students brought various items: copies of the Constitution, photographs of the President, newspaper articles about local elections. James, remembering the hollow nickel, thought it might be interesting to show his classmates. He brought the coin and the paper with numbers to school on October 27, 1953. During his presentation, he explained how he had discovered the hollow coin, showed his classmates the separated shell and core, and passed around the tiny paper with its columns of numbers. Several students examined the items. The teacher, looking at the paper with numbers, suggested that it looked like some kind of code. After class, the teacher asked James if he could borrow the items to show to a friend who worked in law enforcement. James agreed. The teacher, according to his later statement to FBI investigators, had served in the U.S. Army during World War II and had a general awareness of intelligence and counterintelligence matters. The hollow coin and the coded message struck him as potentially significant, not necessarily a game or novelty, but possibly something related to espionage. The teacher's friend was a detective with the New York Police Department who worked in Brooklyn's 66th Precinct. On October 29, 1953, the teacher met the detective for coffee at a diner on Church Avenue and showed him the hollow nickel and the paper. The detective examined both items carefully. Like the teacher, he found the coin and its contents suspicious. The hollow coin was too sophisticated to be a child's toy or a simple novelty item. The numbers were too numerous and too precisely typed to be random. The detective told the teacher he would pass the items to the appropriate authorities. On November 2, 1953, the detective delivered the hollow nickel and the coded message to the FBI's New York field office, located at that time at 201 East 69th Street in Manhattan. The items were received by Special Agent Vincent Mahoney, who was assigned to the office's Soviet counterintelligence squad. Mahoney documented the items, photographed them, and submitted them for analysis. The FBI in 1953 maintained extensive resources for analyzing suspected intelligence materials. The Bureau's laboratory division in Washington, D.C., employed cryptanalysts, document examiners, metallurgists, and other specialists. The hollow nickel and its contents were sent to Washington for examination. The coin itself was determined to be a genuine 1948 Jefferson nickel that had been expertly modified. Someone with considerable skill had carefully hollowed out the interior of the coin, creating a cavity approximately 2 millimeters deep. The coin had then been constructed with two pieces, an outer shell and a solid core that fit together so precisely that when assembled, the coin appeared entirely normal. It would pass casual inspection, could be used in vending machines or payphones if necessary, and would arouse no suspicion unless dropped or examined with particular care. The modification required specialized tools and knowledge, probably a jeweler's lathe and considerable experience working with metal. This was professional intelligence tradecraft, not amateur work. The coded message presented a more complex challenge. The FBI's cryptanalysis section determined that the message consisted of 207 five-digit number groups. This format was consistent with what intelligence professionals called a one-time pad cipher, a nearly unbreakable encryption method used extensively by Soviet intelligence services. The cipher works by pairing each letter or number in the original message with a random key number used only once. The sender and receiver must both possess identical copies of the one-time pad. To encrypt a message, and the sender converts the text to numbers and then adds the key numbers from the pad. To decrypt, the receiver subtracts the same key numbers. If the one-time pad is truly random and used only once, the cipher is mathematically unbreakable without access to the pad itself. The FBI's cryptanalysts could determine that the message used this method, but without the one-time pad that had been used to encrypt it, they could not decrypt the message. The numbers provided no patterns, no repetitions, nothing that could be exploited through mathematical or frequency analysis. The hollow nickel therefore represented both a success and a failure for the FBI. The Bureau had obtained physical evidence of Soviet intelligence operations in the United States, proof that Soviet agents were operating in New York, using sophisticated tradecraft to communicate. But the specific content of the message remained inaccessible, and the coin provided no obvious leads about who had created it, who had possessed it, or who was intended to receive it. The FBI's investigation, designated with the case file number 65-15324, began with the only concrete lead available: the apartment building at 3403 Foster Avenue, where James Bozart had received the nickel in June 1953. Agents interviewed all residents of the building, asking whether anyone recalled paying a newspaper delivery boy with coins in late June, and whether anyone had given the boy a nickel that might have been unusual. The woman who had given James the 55 cents that included the hollow nickel stated that she had no memory of where those particular coins had come from. She handled cash regularly in her work and daily life. The nickel could have come from anywhere, received as change from any of dozens of transactions. Agents expanded their investigation to nearby buildings and questioned residents about suspicious activities or unusual visitors. The neighborhood was working class, populated by families and retirees, electricians, secretaries, salesmen, nurses, teachers. There were no obvious candidates for Soviet intelligence officers or assets, and the interviews produced no useful leads. Without additional leads, the FBI's investigation reached an impasse. The coin and message were filed as evidence of Soviet intelligence activities, but the case remained open and inactive for more than 3 years until a Soviet intelligence officer walked into the U.S. Embassy in Paris. In May 1957, a Soviet intelligence officer named Reino Heihanen requested political asylum. Heihanen, 45 years old, had been operating in the United States as an illegal, a Soviet intelligence officer working without diplomatic cover, using a false identity. According to Heihanen's debriefing by CIA and FBI officers, he had been sent to the United States by the KGB in 1952 with instructions to serve as a courier and assistant to a senior Soviet illegal running intelligence operations in New York. Heihanen's defection was motivated by multiple factors. He had developed a serious drinking problem that was affecting his performance and making him unreliable. He feared he would be recalled to Moscow and punished for his failures. He had also become disillusioned with Soviet ideology and had grown to prefer life in the West. When the KGB ordered him to return to Moscow in early 1957, Heihanen instead fled to Paris and defected. During his debriefing, Heihanen provided extensive information about Soviet intelligence operations in the United States, including details about the senior illegal he had been assigned to assist. This man, Heihanen said, used the cover identity of an artist and photographer. His operational name was Rudolf Ivanovich Abel, though Heihanen believed this might itself be a cover name. Abel had been operating in the United States since approximately 1948, living in New York, running a network of sources who provided classified information to the Soviet Union. Hanen described Abel as a meticulous, highly professional intelligence officer who maintained strict operational security and rarely took unnecessary risks. Abel lived in a studio apartment in Brooklyn, posed as a struggling artist, painted and photographed as part of his cover, and avoided attracting attention. He communicated with Moscow Center, the headquarters of Soviet foreign intelligence, using coded messages, dead drops, and couriers like Hanen. Among the operational details Hanen provided was information about communication methods. He described how messages from Moscow were sometimes delivered to Abel using hollowed-out coins, batteries, or other seemingly ordinary objects. The hollow coins were particularly favored because they were small, easily transported, and aroused no suspicion. FBI officers conducting Hanen's debriefing immediately thought of the hollow nickel discovered in Brooklyn in 1953. They showed Hanen photographs of the coin and the coded message. Hanen examined them and stated with confidence that the hollow nickel matched the concealment devices Abel's operation used. More importantly, Hanen recognized the format of the coded message. Although he could not decrypt it without the one-time pad, he believed it was likely a message from Moscow Center intended for Abel. Hanen speculated about what might have happened. The message, he suggested, had probably been sent to him in 1953, delivered by a courier from Moscow, concealed in the hollow nickel. Hanen's role would have been to deliver the coin to Abel, but Hanen admitted that his drinking had been particularly heavy in 1953, and his memory of that period was imperfect. It was possible, he said, that he had received the coin, forgotten about it in an alcoholic haze, and inadvertently spent it as ordinary currency, never delivering it to Abel. If this scenario was correct, it meant that the message inside the hollow nickel had never reached its intended recipient. Instead, through a combination of Hanen's negligence and extraordinary circumstance, the coin had ended up in the hands of a 14-year-old newspaper delivery boy who had dropped it on his bedroom floor. With Hanen's cooperation, the FBI now had enough information to identify and locate Rudolf Abel. Hanen described Abel's appearance: approximately 60 years old, 5 feet 9 inches tall, thin build, gray hair, spoke English with a slight accent that could be mistaken for European but was actually Russian. Hanen also described Abel's residence, a studio apartment in a building called the Ovington Studios at 252 Fulton Street in Brooklyn Heights, where Abel rented space under the name Emil R. Goldfuss. FBI agents began surveillance of the Ovington Studios on May 30, 1957. The building was a 5-story structure that had been constructed in the 1920s to provide affordable studio spaces for artists. The building's residents included painters, sculptors, photographers, and writers, exactly the kind of environment where someone posing as an artist could blend in without attracting attention. Agents observed a man matching Hanen's description of Abel entering and leaving the building. He carried artist supplies, wore clothing appropriate for someone engaged in painting, and appeared to maintain a routine consistent with someone pursuing an artistic vocation. Surveillance continued for several weeks. Agents documented Abel's movements, his contacts, his routines. On June 21, 1957, almost exactly 4 years after James Bozart had found the hollow nickel, FBI agents executed a search warrant and entered Abel's studio apartment. The raid occurred early in the morning, approximately 6:30 a.m., while Abel was still inside. 7 agents participated in the operation. According to FBI reports, Abel appeared unsurprised when agents knocked on his door and identified themselves. He opened the door calmly, stepped aside to allow them entry, and made no attempt to resist or flee. One of the agents later described Abel's reaction as unnervingly composed, almost as if he had been expecting this moment for years and had mentally prepared himself for it. The search of Abel's studio produced an extraordinary collection of espionage equipment and materials. Agents found multiple hollowed-out coins, similar to the one James Bozart had discovered. They found hollowed-out batteries, bolts, and other objects designed to conceal messages or microfilm. They found a short-wave radio capable of receiving encrypted transmissions from Moscow. They found multiple one-time pads, the cipher keys needed to encrypt and decrypt messages. They found cameras and equipment for photographing documents. They found $4,000 in cash hidden in various locations around the apartment. They found multiple false identity documents, birth certificates, social security cards, driver's licenses, all bearing different names but Abel's photograph. Among the one-time pads discovered in Abel's apartment, FBI cryptanalysts later determined, was the specific pad that would have been used to decrypt the message from the hollow nickel found in 1953. Using this pad, the Bureau was able to decrypt the message. It read, "We congratulate you on a safe arrival. We confirm the receipt of your letter to the address, V repeat V, and the reading of letter number 1. For organization of cover, we gave instructions to transmit to you 3,000 in local currency. Consult with us prior to investing it in any kind of business, advising the character of this business. According to your request, we will transmit the formula for the preparation of soft film and news separately, together with your mother's letter. It is too early to send you the gammas. Encipher short letters, but the longer ones make with insertions. All the data about yourself, place of work, address, etc., must not be transmitted in one cipher message. Transmit insertions separately. The package was delivered to your wife personally. Everything is all right with the family. We wish you success. Greetings from the comrades. Number 1, 3rd of December. The message was dated December 3rd, 1952. It had been sent from Moscow Center to an agent in the United States, almost certainly to Abel himself, though possibly to another operative in his network. The message referenced Abel's arrival in the United States, acknowledged receipt of communications from Abel, promised the delivery of money and materials, and provided instructions for future communications. The reference to your wife suggested that the KGB had made contact with Abel's wife, who remained in the Soviet Union. The message's tone was professional but also reassuring, indicating that Moscow valued Abel's work and wanted to maintain his morale and commitment. The fact that this message had never reached Abel, that it had instead been discovered by a 14-year-old boy in Brooklyn, represented a significant operational failure for Soviet intelligence. However, because the message did not contain actionable intelligence about specific sources or operations, the damage was limited. The primary consequence was the eventual identification and arrest of Abel himself, but that occurred only because Heihanen defected and provided information that allowed the FBI to connect Abel to the hollow nickel. Rudolf Ivanovich Abel was not his real name. FBI investigators eventually determined that he had been born William August Fisher in Newcastle upon Tyne, England, in 1903. His father, Heinrich Fischer, was a Russian-German revolutionary who had lived in exile in England before returning to Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution. William Fisher had grown up in Russia, joined Soviet intelligence in the 1920s, and worked as an intelligence officer for more than 30 years by the time of his arrest in 1957. Fisher had adopted the identity Rudolf Abel after the real Rudolf Abel, a Soviet intelligence officer who had died during World War II. Using Abel's documents and identity, Fisher had constructed a cover story that would allow him to operate in the West. The name stuck, and he became known as Rudolf Abel, even though it was not his birth name. Abel's background, as revealed through FBI investigation and his own eventual admissions, showed him to be an exceptionally skilled intelligence professional. He spoke fluent English, German, Russian, Polish, and Yiddish. He was genuinely talented as an artist. His paintings were competent, his photography was skilled, and his cover as a struggling artist was convincing because he actually possessed artistic ability. He was patient, cautious, and disciplined in his operational security. According to Heihanen, Abel rarely took unnecessary risks, maintained minimal contact with sources, and conducted himself in a manner designed to avoid attracting any attention from counterintelligence services. The FBI's investigation into Abel's activities in the United States uncovered evidence of a network of sources and contacts. Abel had been recruiting and running agents since his arrival in 1948. His sources included Americans with access to classified information in various government agencies and defense contractors. The exact number of sources Abel handled and the specific information they provided was never fully determined. Many of Abel's sources were never identified, and Abel himself refused to cooperate with investigators or provide information about his network. Abel was charged with conspiracy to commit espionage. The trial began in October 1957 in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York, with Judge Mortimer Byers presiding. The prosecution presented extensive evidence: the espionage equipment found in Abel's apartment, Heihanen's testimony about Abel's activities and role, the decrypted message from the hollow nickel, expert testimony about Soviet intelligence methods and tradecraft. Abel's defense attorney, James B. Donovan, argued that Heihanen was an unreliable witness whose testimony was motivated by self-interest and whose ongoing drinking problem had led him to fabricate or exaggerate Abel's importance. Donovan challenged the admissibility of evidence obtained from the search of Abel's apartment, arguing that the search warrant had been improperly obtained. He portrayed Abel as an artist who had been wrongly accused based on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a discredited defector. The jury deliberated for approximately 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. On November 15, 1957, Judge Byers sentenced Abel to 30 years in federal prison. Abel was also fined $3,000. He was initially incarcerated at the federal detention headquarters in Manhattan, then transferred to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia. Abel's arrest and conviction received significant media attention. The case was portrayed in newspapers as a major counterintelligence success, the capture of a master Soviet spy who had operated undetected in the United States for nearly a decade. The story of the hollow nickel and the 14-year-old boy who had accidentally discovered it added an element of almost implausible circumstance to the narrative. Reporters interviewed James Bozart, now 18 years old, who described finding the coin and expressed amazement that such a small discovery had led to such significant consequences. For James Bozart, the experience of being connected to a major espionage case was surreal and overwhelming. According to later interviews, he received letters from people around the country congratulating him or asking for his autograph. His photograph appeared in newspapers alongside articles about Abel's trial. At school, teachers and classmates treated him as a minor celebrity. The attention was flattering but also disorienting. James had simply been doing his newspaper route, collecting payment, dropping a coin. The fact that this ordinary action had contributed to exposing a Soviet spy network seemed to him almost unbelievable. Abel served approximately 5 years of his 30-year sentence. During his imprisonment, he maintained his discipline and bearing, refusing to provide information about Soviet intelligence operations or to identify any of his sources or contacts. He spent his time in prison reading, painting, and maintaining correspondence with his family in the Soviet Union through approved channels. In February 1962, Abel became the central figure in one of the Cold War's most famous prisoner exchanges. On May 1, 1960, an American U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers had been shot down over Soviet territory. Powers, a CIA pilot conducting reconnaissance flights over the Soviet Union, had been captured, tried for espionage, and sentenced to 10 years in Soviet prison. The United States and Soviet Union, through back-channel negotiations, eventually agreed to exchange Abel for Powers. The exchange took place on February 10, 1962, on the Glienicke Bridge connecting West Berlin and Potsdam in East Germany. The bridge, which crossed the Havel River, had become a traditional location for Cold War prisoner exchanges. At approximately 8:30 a.m. on that cold winter morning, American and Soviet officials met at the center of the bridge. Abel was escorted from the American side, Powers from the Soviet side. The two men passed each other on the bridge, Powers walking toward freedom and return to the United States, Abel walking toward return to the Soviet Union and to the intelligence service that had trained him and sent him to America 14 years earlier. According to accounts from officials present at the exchange, Abel gave nothing away, showing little emotion as he crossed to the Soviet side. He had expected to serve many years in prison, possibly the full 30-year sentence. The opportunity to return to the Soviet Union was almost certainly welcome, though Abel's personality was such that he revealed little of what he felt. After returning to the Soviet Union, Abel resumed work for Soviet intelligence in a training and consulting capacity. He was awarded the Order of Lenin, the Soviet Union's highest civilian honor, in recognition of his service. He lived in Moscow, where he was reunited with his wife, Yelena, and his daughter, Evelyn. According to Soviet sources, he continued to work training intelligence officers until his retirement. Abel died in Moscow on November 15, 1971, at the age of 68. Soviet authorities announced his death but provided few details. He was buried with full honors in Moscow's Donskoye Cemetery, a burial ground reserved for distinguished Soviet citizens. His tombstone, erected years later, identified him by his birth name, William Fisher, rather than by the cover name, Rudolf Abel, under which he had become famous. For Francis Gary Powers, the pilot exchanged for Abel, the experience of imprisonment and exchange was traumatic. After returning to the United States, Powers faced criticism from some quarters for failing to activate the U-2's self-destruct mechanism before being captured, and for cooperating with Soviet interrogators rather than maintaining absolute silence. These criticisms were largely unfair. Powers had been injured in the shoot-down and had cooperated only minimally with Soviet authorities, but they affected his reputation and his post-exchange career. Powers worked for Lockheed Aircraft Corporation as a test pilot, then later as a helicopter pilot for a Los Angeles television station. He died in a helicopter crash in 1977 at the age of 47. James Bozart. The newspaper delivery boy whose dropped nickel had started the chain of events lived a quiet life, far removed from espionage or international intrigue. He graduated from high school, attended college, and eventually worked in business management. According to later accounts, he rarely discussed the hollow nickel case unless specifically asked about it, and he viewed his role as almost entirely accidental. He had been in the right place at the right time. or perhaps the wrong place at the wrong time, depending on perspective. Reino Heihanen, the defector whose information led to Abel's identification and arrest, was relocated by the CIA to an undisclosed location in the United States with a new identity. His alcoholism continued to plague him. He died in 1961, approximately 4 years after his defection, under circumstances that were never fully explained. Some sources suggest he died in a car accident, others that he died from complications related to chronic alcoholism. His body was reportedly returned to his family in Finland, but details of his death and burial remain unclear. The hollow nickel itself became a piece of evidence, then a historical artifact. After Abel's trial concluded, the FBI retained the coin and the coded message as part of the case file. In later years, the nickel and related materials from the Abel case were displayed at the FBI's headquarters in Washington, D.C., as part of exhibits illustrating the Bureau's counterintelligence work during the Cold War. Visitors could see the coin, split open to reveal its hollow interior, alongside photographs of Abel, surveillance images, and other artifacts from the case. The broader significance of the Abel case relates to the nature of Cold War intelligence operations and the role of circumstance in counterintelligence work. Soviet intelligence operations in the United States during the 1940s and 1950s were extensive and sophisticated. The KGB and its predecessor organizations had developed elaborate systems for recruiting sources, collecting intelligence, and communicating securely with agents operating under cover in foreign countries. Abel represented one type of Soviet intelligence officer, the illegal, operating without diplomatic cover, living under a false identity, working alone or with minimal support. Illegals like Abel were valued for their independence and their ability to operate without the restrictions and vulnerabilities associated with diplomatic cover. But they were also isolated, dependent on communications from Moscow that could be delayed or compromised, and vulnerable to detection if any element of their cover story or operational security failed. The illegal's life was one of sustained deception. Abel had lived as Emil Goldfuss for nearly a decade, maintaining a cover story, associating with people who knew him only as an artist, concealing his real identity and activities from everyone around him. This kind of sustained deception required extraordinary discipline and psychological resilience. Abel could not relax his guard, could not confide in anyone, could not allow himself the comfort of authenticity in his relationships or daily life. The psychological cost of this existence is difficult to assess. Abel himself left no memoir or detailed account of his experiences. After his exchange and return to the Soviet Union, he gave limited interviews to Soviet media in which he portrayed his work as a patriotic duty and expressed pride in his service. But these official statements provide little insight into the personal experience of living a double life for so many years. The question of what Abel actually accomplished during his 9 years in the United States is difficult to answer with precision because much of the relevant documentation remains classified or was destroyed. The FBI's investigation identified some of Abel's sources and some of the information he collected, but Abel refused to cooperate with investigators, and the full extent of his network was never determined. Assessments by U.S. intelligence agencies suggested that Abel had provided the Soviet Union with valuable information about American military capabilities, defense technologies, and intelligence operations, but the specific impact of this information on Soviet military planning or policy is unknown. From the Soviet perspective, Abel's arrest and conviction represented a significant loss. He was an experienced, highly trained intelligence officer who had successfully established himself in the United States and built a functioning network. His arrest compromised not only his own operations, but also the operations of any sources he had recruited, and it required the KGB to rebuild intelligence capabilities that had taken years to develop. The fact that Abel's exposure resulted from Heihanen's defection and incompetence, that Heihanen had apparently lost the hollow nickel message through carelessness, would have been viewed as a serious operational failure requiring investigation and accountability. For the United States, the Abel case represented a counterintelligence success, but also a reminder of vulnerability. If one Soviet illegal had operated successfully in New York for nearly a decade, how many others might be operating elsewhere in the country, undetected? The FBI's investigation of Abel had revealed sophisticated tradecraft, professional discipline, and extensive resources devoted to intelligence collection. The decrypted message from the hollow nickel had referenced the formula for the preparation of soft film, materials used in espionage photography, and had instructed Abel about communication procedures and security measures. This indicated a well-organized, well-resourced intelligence operation with established protocols and long-term planning. The Abel case contributed to increased emphasis on counterintelligence within the FBI and other U.S. intelligence agencies. It demonstrated the value of human sources. Heihanen's defection had provided information that years of surveillance and investigation had not produced. It also demonstrated the importance of seemingly minor details. The hollow nickel, dropped through sheer accident, had provided physical evidence of Soviet intelligence activities and had eventually connected to Abel's arrest, even though the connection took years to establish. The role of James Bozart in this story raises questions about the relationship between ordinary citizens and intelligence operations. Bozart was not a trained investigator, not a counterintelligence professional, not someone with any particular expertise in espionage. He was a 14-year-old boy who dropped a coin and noticed that it appeared unusual. His decision to keep the coin, to show it to his teacher, and his teacher's decision to report it to authorities were all actions that could easily have gone differently. The coin could have been discarded, ignored, forgotten. This element of happenstance is characteristic of many counterintelligence successes. Intelligence operations depend on planning, training, and systematic work, but they also depend on alertness to anomalies, on following up on seemingly minor details, on recognizing that something ordinary might actually be significant. The fact that the hollow nickel turned out to be connected to a major Soviet intelligence operation vindicated the FBI's decision to investigate thoroughly what might have seemed like a trivial matter. For the Bozart family, the experience of being connected to a major espionage case was surreal, but ultimately had little lasting impact. According to later accounts, James's parents were proud of their son's inadvertent role in the case, but did not view it as anything more than an accident of circumstance. The family did not seek publicity or attempt to profit from the connection. James returned to his ordinary life, finished school, pursued a career, and by all accounts never sought to use his connection to the Abel case for personal advantage. The hollow nickel case has been retold numerous times in books, articles, and films about Cold War espionage. The 2015 film Bridge of Spies, directed by Steven Spielberg and starring Tom Hanks as James Donovan, Abel's defense attorney, brought renewed attention to the case and to the prisoner exchange on the Glinica Bridge. The film portrayed Abel sympathetically as a professional doing his duty, and portrayed Donovan as a principled lawyer defending an unpopular client in order to uphold American legal values. These retellings have tended to focus on the dramatic elements: the master spy operating in plain sight, the dropped coin that exposed him, the tense prisoner exchange. They have less often explored the more mundane realities of intelligence work. The years of routine surveillance that produced no results, the painstaking analysis of documents and evidence, the diplomatic negotiations required to arrange the exchange, the bureaucratic processes within intelligence agencies that determine priorities and allocated resources. The question of how to evaluate Abel's life and work remains complex. From the Soviet perspective, he was a loyal officer who served his country effectively and maintained his discipline even after arrest and imprisonment. From the American perspective, he was a foreign spy who violated U.S. law, betrayed the trust of people who knew him under false pretenses, and facilitated the theft of classified information that potentially harmed U.S. national security. Both perspectives contain truth. Abel did violate U.S. law and did facilitate espionage against the United States. He also acted according to the values and commitments of the system he served. He was not motivated by greed. There is no evidence he sought personal enrichment from his espionage work beyond operational expenses. He appears to have been a professional intelligence officer who viewed his work as a job, who executed that job with skill and dedication, and who accepted the risks associated with it. The impact on Abel's family, his wife and daughter, who lived in the Soviet Union during his years in America and his years in prison, is less documented but was undoubtedly significant. Yelena Abel lived for years not knowing whether her husband was safe or in danger. When he was arrested and imprisoned, she faced the possibility that he would spend the rest of his life in an American prison, that she might never see him again. When he was exchanged and returned, she regained a husband who had been gone for more than a decade, who had aged, who had experienced things she could not fully understand. Their daughter, Evelyn, had been a child when Abel left for America in 1948. By the time he returned in 1962, she was an adult, having spent her adolescence and young adulthood with an absent father. The message in the hollow nickel, decrypted years after it was sent, provides a glimpse into the relationship between intelligence officers and their handlers. The message's tone, congratulatory, reassuring, promising support, suggests that Moscow Center valued Abel and wanted to maintain his commitment and effectiveness. The reference to your wife and everything is all right with the family indicates that the KGB used Abel's concern for his family as a form of control and motivation. The promise of 3,000 in local currency and the careful instructions about communication security show both the resources devoted to Abel's operation and the constant concern about operational security. The fact that this message never reached Abel because of Heihanen's negligence raises questions about the efficiency and reliability of Soviet intelligence operations. Heihanen was by all accounts a poor intelligence officer, unreliable, alcoholic, sloppy in his work. That he was assigned to support Abel, a senior and valuable illegal, suggests either poor judgment in Moscow's personnel decisions or a shortage of capable officers available for assignment in the United States. The exchange of Abel for powers in 1962 reflected both countries' pragmatic approach to intelligence matters. Both men were intelligence professionals who had been captured while conducting operations. Both countries valued the return of their own officer more than the continued imprisonment of the other country's officer. The exchange was a transaction, not a gesture of reconciliation or trust. It acknowledged the reality that intelligence operations were an ongoing feature of the Cold War competition, and that captured intelligence officers could be useful as bargaining chips for future exchanges. The Glianica Bridge, where the exchange took place, became a symbol of Cold War tensions and the human dimension of intelligence operations. The image of prisoners walking across a bridge, passing each other at the midpoint between East and West, captured something essential about the Cold War. The division of the world into hostile camps, the human cost of that division, the possibility of negotiated transactions even in the absence of broader agreement or trust. The contrast between public reactions to Abel and Powers is instructive. Abel was portrayed in American media as a professional who had accepted his capture with dignity, and his exchange was widely accepted as reasonable. Powers, by contrast, faced criticism from Americans who expected him to have died rather than allow capture or believed he should have resisted interrogation more forcefully. This reflects how societies view intelligence work. Enemy spies can be respected as professionals, while one's own personnel are expected to meet higher standards, demonstrating absolute loyalty, enduring any hardship, choosing death over capture if necessary. These expectations are often unrealistic and unfair, but they reflect the symbolic importance societies attach to intelligence work. Powers had been injured in the shootdown, had been captured through no fault of his own, and had cooperated minimally with Soviet interrogators while protecting sensitive information. Yet he faced years of suspicion and criticism that affected his post-exchange career and personal life. James Bozart was 14 years old when he dropped a nickel on his bedroom floor. That moment, the coin falling, splitting open, revealing its secret, set in motion a chain of events that led to the exposure of a Soviet spy network, the arrest and conviction of a master intelligence officer, and eventually a Cold War prisoner exchange. Bozart could not have known any of this when he picked up the split coin and examined the tiny paper with its columns of numbers. He was simply a boy who had found something unusual and had been curious enough to keep it and show it to others. Rudolf Abel was 60 when he crossed the Glienicke Bridge and returned to the Soviet Union. He lived another 9 years, working, training others, maintaining his discipline and professionalism to the end. He was buried with honors in Moscow, remembered as a loyal officer who had served effectively under difficult conditions. Reino Heihanen was 49 when he died in 1961, alone in America under a false identity, his defection having exposed Abel, but given himself little except exile and isolation. Francis Gary Powers was 32 when he was exchanged for Abel. He lived another 15 years, working, trying to rebuild a life after imprisonment and controversy, until his death in a helicopter crash in 1977. And the hollow nickel remained, preserved as evidence and artifact, a small object that had contained a message that never reached its intended recipient, a piece of metal and paper that had, through extraordinary circumstance, revealed secrets and changed lives. In its preserved, split-open state, it testified to the reality that even the most sophisticated intelligence operations depend on tradecraft that can fail, that even the most carefully planned operations can be undone by happenstance, and that sometimes the smallest details matter most.